We're finishing up with John Knox. We left off with a cliffhanger. Just to remind you, these three Marys: Mary Tudor, Queen of England, until 1558. She is Bloody Mary to Protestants. Catholic, persecutes the Reformation movement in England. And Knox's ill-timed book, The First Blast Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, was really targeted at Mary Tudor, or really was targeted at Mary Tudor, but then she soon died, and then Elizabeth, her half-sister, begins her long reign. In Scotland, we have Mary of Guise, who is the Queen Mother, so she's the regent. A regent means the person who rules in place of somebody else. So her infant daughter was sent off to France, so she was raised basically as a courtier in France. When Mary of Guise dies suddenly, it opens up a window in 1560 and 61 for the Protestant Reformation to really be established in Scotland. And Knox is influential in the Scots Confession, in the first book of Discipline. And if we are to date the beginning of Presbyterianism, of course, dates to Jesus and the Apostles, I'm sure, but in history after that, we would say most clearly to John Knox and to 1560 in Scotland. But that's not quite the end of the story, because just when things seem to be going swimmingly, Mary, Queen of Scots, returns to Scotland in 1561. She was a French Catholic, basically, who's now coming home, though it hadn't really been her home, coming home to rule over an officially Protestant people. Her first night back in Scotland, and I know a number of you said you've been to Scotland before, you really should go to Edinburgh. You just stand on the other side, you stand at Princes Street, you look at the Royal Mile. It does look like the scene of some fairy tale, and you have the castle at the top of the Royal Mile, and going down the hill at the bottom, well, you have, if you can excuse my personal opinion, you have an extremely ugly, modern-looking Parliament building toward the bottom there. And then at the very bottom of the Royal Mile, you have Holyrood Palace. Her first night back at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, the Protestants make sure to welcome her home by serenading her with metrical psalms, which, remember, was a way of saying, we are Protestants. That's what the singing of the psalms meant. To no one's surprise, Knox and Mary, Queen of Scots, had a tumultuous relationship. They disliked each other, they did not trust each other, and yet at times they did this delicate political, religious kind of dance, not literally, but dance to try to get along. They famously had 5 interviews, they're called. Mary, as I said last week, was still a teenager, 19 years old when she came back. She was vivacious, intelligent. Everyone reputed that she was beautiful, and she was tall, almost 6 feet tall, which would be very tall today, and was extremely tall. She was probably a head taller than most of the men, and certainly than Knox, who was short and stout. Knox, of course, was not intimidated, and he was unbending in his religious views. He did try to half apologize for the trumpet blast. That was not ingratiating him to Mary, Queen of Scots, and he basically said, I don't disagree with any of it, but I'll keep my mouth shut, which did not, assuage things with Mary. Now, Mary's closest advisors were Protestants, and they did try to steer a middle course within reason, and yet it was never going to be a close alliance. You may have heard the famous statement. It is said that Mary once remarked, I fear the prayers of John Knox more than all the assembled armies of Europe. Knox's ministry in Edinburgh, so he was at St. Giles Cathedral, still go there, and there's a statue of Knox, and he's buried in a parking spot somewhere up on the Royal Mile, and there's a little house for where John Knox lived for a time, and he's very much forgotten and even hard to find where he might have lived or been buried. But the church still stands as a beautiful church there on the Royal Mile. You can go walk in it and see the statue there of John Knox. He was never one to stay out of the fray or to stay quiet, and he bounced back and forth between Edinburgh and over on the west, past Glasgow in the area of Ayrshire. He even thought about going to Ireland with his friend Christopher Goodman. He was his best friend. He served with him in Geneva. And he went over to Ayrshire sometimes when he needed to collect himself, and then he would come back to Edinburgh. Now, for his part, Knox never trusted Mary. You can sort of understand. Remember, Knox had been a galley slave for 19 months. He had in his mind, here's what can and probably will happen if we have a Catholic monarch. This is what Catholics are going to do to Protestants. So he never trusted Mary. In 1565, and here the history becomes very convoluted and we'll move through it very quickly, Mary wed her first cousin, yes, that happened often, Lord Darnley, and a year later, James VI was born. James VI of Scotland, who will be James I of England. But the marriage was in trouble. Darnley wanted to be more than the consort of the queen. He wasn't the king, he's just the consort. He's married to the queen. He really wanted to be joint sovereign. And so, perhaps for political reasons, as much as religious reasons, he switches over to the Protestant side. In 1567, Lord Darnley, so this is Mary's husband, is assassinated. He's smothered to death by another noble named Lord Bothwell. And in a great scandal to even Catholics, but especially to Protestants, a few months later, Mary marries Lord Bothwell. Historians still, what? He murdered her husband. Doesn't seem that she was plotting for her husband to be murdered. Maybe she didn't feel like she had a choice in the matter, but she marries Lord Bothwell, the man who just murdered her husband. The Scottish government says enough, and they formally depose Mary. Okay, you are not the queen. Now you may say, why didn't you just do this before? But remember, they're not Americans. They don't just get rid of kings and queens. But they finally do. They depose her. They imprison her. She manages to escape. She flees to England, and she thinks, England, they have Queen Elizabeth, and she is going to be my help. But Elizabeth says, not so fast. I am not interested in helping a renegade, escaped Catholic queen from Scotland. So for the rest of her life, she lives either imprisoned or under house arrest for 20 years until Mary, Queen of Scots, is finally executed in 1587 because it was uncovered that she had been working with some assassins in a plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, or at least she was implicated in it. So that's a way to end your life. Scotland, going back to Scotland, even when Mary, Queen of Scots, was overthrown, it was not at rest. There was still much reformation to be done, and Knox himself was slowing down. In October 1570, he suffered a stroke that left him permanently weakened on his left side. From that point, he had to be helped up into the pulpit. Sometimes he had to be carried into the pulpit, but he continued to preach. In St. Andrews, remember, that's where he was with the Protestant refugees at the beginning of this mess, and he went back there to preach, sometimes in St. Andrews, then back at St. Giles in Edinburgh, and the discipline of preparing for sermons probably kept him alive another 2 years. In 1571, there was an attempt on his life. An assassin's bullet went through his study window and barely missed him. On November 24, 1572, finally, John Knox dies. His wife, Margaret, Meg, as he called her, read to him John 17. He died in his bed, 58 years old. Doesn't it strike you? It strikes me as how old am I? 47. Man, I do hope the Lord gives me more than these people had, but most of these people are, if you're getting into your 50s, you're usually doing pretty well. By all accounts, Knox was a force of nature, especially in the pulpit. Somebody asked me, well, it seems like this depiction of Knox from last week is a little bit negative, and I don't mean it to be negative, but I do want to be honest about all these people, even though Many of these people are heroes to us. He, like all of us, had great strengths and some weaknesses, and those strengths and weaknesses were usually the inverse. He was inflexible. Sometimes he'd be rash and impetuous, but it also meant he was absolutely fearless, courageous, and he was what Scotland needed at that moment. Now, it's interesting to think about which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Was it the nature of the Scottish people that produced someone like Knox, or did Knox shape the Scottish character, and vice versa with Cranmer? Because even today, if you think about English preaching and Scottish preaching, or sort of English approach, it's often has the reputation of being middle of the road, stiff upper lip, keep yourself calm. That's sort of the stereotype. And when I go to Scotland, they say, would you preach about the unction of the Holy Spirit? A fiery people. And that's John Knox, and we can see when we looked at Cranmer. So it's probably some of both. Both they influenced and were influenced by. Unlike any of the other reformers we've looked at, now he wrote a lot. He had sermons published, he had theological tracts, but he's not read today like Calvin or Luther for their theological treatises or the institutes. The most important thing, and I do like this myself, that Knox wrote was a history. I appreciate that as someone who's probably my favorite subject is history. A history of the Reformation in Scotland. And it shaped the Scottish identity, the Scottish understanding. There's a lot of ways to make a difference in the world, and one of them is to write history and shape how people remember and see things. Now, you don't want to be untruthful, but he shaped Scotland. He had a flair for the dramatic. He had that his whole life. One writer said contemporary writer said he had the instincts of a script writer. Remember way at the beginning when he attached himself to George Wishart and he grabbed that huge double-handed sword? You saw there, he had a flair for the dramatic. He knew what would make for a good story. And you see that there in his book on the history of the Reformation in Scotland. Today, to use very anachronistic terms, we might say that he was more of a populist than an elite. Meaning, though he was an elite by the standards of the day, and he's meeting with magistrates and kings and queens, yet he didn't tend to trust those who had power, and he tended to be most beloved by the people. He was not interested in running a city like Calvin ran Geneva or Zwingli ran Zurich. He didn't want to negotiate choppy political waters like Cranmer did in England. He was not one who gave his life to build institutions, which is valuable. He gave his life to announce the truth of God's word. He saw himself really as a prophet. Like Ezekiel, he was a watchman on the walls, and he was warning Scotland, here's what will happen. If we are not true to the Reformed faith, God will send judgment upon us. It wasn't just that he feared a Catholic monarch. He considered that that would be the Lord's judgment upon the Scottish people if they were not true to the Reformation. His strength was owing to his courage, his fortitude, his integrity, his absolute unwillingness. He could not be bought with money. He could not be bought with ecclesiastical privilege. He was a thunderous preacher. And with those strengths, there were some weaknesses. He tended to see the world in black and white, which helped when it was black and white, but sometimes there's gray, or sometimes you don't die on this hill because there's a bigger hill worth dying on. He did tend to see everyone as a loyal friend or a Christ-hating enemy. And though he was a good pastor, he didn't seem to have the patience to stay in one place, nor the temperament, like Calvin, for organization and administration. He had many close friends, and especially had a loyal band of brothers, and he would not have and did not make the compromises that Cranmer made. So as I said last week, he's sort of the reverse image of Cranmer, who we might fault for making some compromises and yet was shrewd and tactical and in the end proved to be courageous. Knox, on the other hand, was not willing to give up an inch in the short term in order that he might try to gain a foot in the long term. But he was righteously inflexible and bold, sometimes brash, but it was what Scotland needed. Not a politician, not even an organizer, and not in that moment a consensus builder, but needed John Knox to be a prophet, and that's what he was. So John Knox, now you know the rest of the story. We move on. First time, if you permit a Mr. Rogers moment. All right, so we have these. I grew up with these all over our house, and we still have these. And look they still fit. There you go. So I don't know how comfortable it will be preaching or teaching the whole time. I'm going to trip. Today we should have orange marker. We are looking at someone you probably know very little about, and I would say, even given my last name, I learned as much about this one as any of the weeks so far. I'll take those off. We're moving to the Netherlands. Of all the nations in Western Europe who took a turn at the top of the continental heap, the most surprising from our vantage point is probably the Netherlands. How many of you proudly claim some Dutch heritage? All right, yeah, my people. All right, very good. Mike Wiersma, there you go. All of these Dutch names, they're not difficult. They're just normal. Grew up with Klein Hesselinks and Klein Wolterinks and Hoekstras, and they're all very normal. The Netherlands is geographically tiny and at times submerged underwater. Today, what we know as the Netherlands was at one point, a fourth of it was underwater. I like to say that that's why the Dutch are the tallest people on the planet. They had to get their heads above water. They are now the tallest people. At least I think there's a certain tribe in Africa that is vying for the title as well. But during the Dutch Golden Age, in the 17th century, so the Dutch Golden Age, and we'll see William the Silent is just preceding this, from 1588 to 1672. This is sometimes called the Dutch century. Now, there were other great powers in Europe, of course, at the time, but during this Golden Age, the Dutch enjoyed the highest standard of living in Europe. They possessed the largest merchant fleet, they had the most powerful navy, and they dominated global commerce. You've probably heard of the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company. Those were sometimes very rapacious corporations, but they were two of the first multinational corporations in the world. The Bank of Amsterdam was probably the first central bank in the world, and the art and the architecture to come out of the Netherlands in the 17th century, all the Dutch masters, are still considered some of the most beautiful, impressive works ever produced. During this golden age, the Netherlands was likely the richest and most scientifically advanced country in Europe. They also had a vast empire. Now we think of the British having an empire, Spain, Portugal, but the Dutch, down to the bottom of Africa, over to South America, the islands of the Far East, like Indonesia, and most famously, from our perspective, in the 1620s, the Dutch established the fort of New Amsterdam. Even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Why they changed it, I can't say. I guess they liked it better that way. They might be giants. Look it up. The song Istanbul was Constantinople. So they founded this Dutch colony in New York. It was New Amsterdam. And then when the British took over, scrubbed out the Amsterdam and gave one of their nobles and called it New York. But today, in that area, up the Hudson River and down through the middle colonies, you can still find lots of Dutch names and Dutch influences. One of my favorite trivia facts of American history. And I have a lot of trivia facts I enjoy. But here's one that you may not have known before. The first U.S. president to be born in America, that is, he was not born a British citizen, ergo, he was born after 1776. So the first U.S. president to be born in America was also the only president to date to grow up speaking a first language other than English. Martin van Buren. Martin van Buren, he was Dutch. He grew up speaking Dutch. I forget if his parents or his grandparents had immigrated. And he is buried in the town of his birth in the cemetery of Kinderhook Reformed Dutch Church, which is an RCA congregation, my former denomination. That church dates back to 1712. Not generally regarded one of the best presidents, but Dutch. Two other Dutch presidents, much more famous, if you recognize their last name, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. So we're also now, Teddy Roosevelt, I think, had his beginning in the Dutch Reformed Church. I think by the time of FDR, they were Episcopalians. But the reason for studying the Netherlands, besides my august last name, is not because of its economic, cultural prowess, but because the history of the Netherlands is especially important in church history for people like us because of its outsized influence in Reformed Protestant Christianity. The 5 points of Calvinism, so-called, came out of the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 19, which was largely a Dutch synod, took place in the Dutch city of Dordrecht. You've heard me say before, as far as we've traced back the DeYoung genealogy to about the 1690s, they come from the city of Dordrecht. The Dutch Second Reformation, or Further Reformation, as it's called, of the 17th and 18th centuries produced a deep well of devotional theological resources. People like, and maybe you've heard of some of these, but not all of them, Jean Taffin, Gisbertus Vucius, Herman Vitzius, Wilhelmus à Brakel, Johannes à Mark, Petrus van Maastricht. They're some of the great Dutch writers the 17th and early 18th century. Outside of Scotland, we just traveled from Scotland, just across the North Sea to the Netherlands. Scotland and the Netherlands would become the only lasting Calvinist countries in Europe. Hungary had a time of great Calvinist influence. There's a Hungarian Reformed Church to this day. Poland did as well. And France had a lot happen, and Switzerland. But lasting Calvinist countries, you look at Scotland and you look at the Netherlands, which is why we have Presbyterians. They come from the Scottish line, and Reformed tend to come from the continent, from the French, from the Swiss, or often from the Dutch. The two are very similar. They both are streams from Calvin, but they have some differences. But Presbyterian and Reformed, you can think of Presbyterian perhaps as a smaller subset of the larger Reformed movement. But typically, if we say Reformed today, we're thinking of those Calvinists that came from the continent at some point, and Presbyterians are those who came from the British Isles, from Scotland, and from Northern Ireland, usually. Many of the leading Reformed theologians after the Reformation came from the Netherlands, were trained in the Netherlands, or linked to movements in the Netherlands. Remember, you still have Latin as the lingua franca, so that's why all these people, they can communicate with each other. They can read each other's books, though their first language may be French or German or English, but they write and can communicate in Latin. Even today, some of the most well-known theologians among Reformed Christians have Dutch names. Bavinck, Berkhoff, Vos, Van Til. If you've ever had to write a paper in your life for a theology class and do your bibliography, most of the books are from Grand Rapids, Michigan, because there are 4 publishing houses founded by Dutch immigrants in Grand Rapids. Kriegel in 1909, Erdmans in 1911, Zondervan in 1931, and Baker in 1939. And some of those were even splits among their own families. They couldn't get along, and so they started another publishing house. There are 12 provinces in the Netherlands today, and you probably wouldn't know this unless you're from West Michigan like I am, but these provinces, most of them are little or minor, mid-sized cities, or some of them stoplight towns in parts of West Michigan. Drenthe, Friesland, Groningen, North Holland. I was born in South Holland, Illinois. I lived for 2 summers in Overijssel, Michigan. We had family reunions in Zeeland, Michigan. I went to college in Holland, Michigan. So you can see we had to do this week's discussion. Those are all provinces from the Netherlands. Given the far-reaching influence of the Dutch Reformed Church, we have to understand how, and I think even among Reformed Christians, they know, okay, Dort, yes, Dutch Reformed. How did the Netherlands become a bastion of Calvinism? That story is bound up with the story of how the Netherlands became the Netherlands. And the central figure in that story, I'll admit, is not a great theologian. And though his commitment to Calvinism, I think, was sincere, we're not talking about him because of his exemplary piety throughout his whole life. He was a statesman, a general, a nobleman who eventually embraced the Reformed faith, and he led the Dutch in their campaign for freedom and independence, and that is this man here, William the Silent. I'll explain in a moment where he gets that name. Also, William the First, or you may know him by the color that has come to be so closely associated with the Dutch. You see it at the Olympics or the World Cup, and that is William of Orange. William was born April 24, 1533. He actually wasn't from the Netherlands. He was from Germany, from a place called Dillenburg, one of 12 children in a noble family of the House of Nassau. All of these noble families in different parts of the Holy Roman Empire, he was from the House of Nassau. Although he would go on to be hailed by the Dutch as, quote, the father of the fatherland, he has a place in Dutch history like George Washington would have in American history. He was not born in the Netherlands. He was born and raised in Germany. In fact, the Dutch national anthem has a line, William of Nassau, I am of German blood. He was raised a Lutheran. That's important. We're getting to the second generation of reformers. He's not really a reformer, but he's in this reform movement, who are now, some of them, raised not as Catholics, but as Protestants. He was raised a Lutheran in Dillenburg, Germany, and at 11 years old, he inherits this property in Orange. Now, Orange, is that in the Netherlands? No, that's not in the Netherlands either. That's in southern France. And it's a city that goes way back to Roman times, and it seems like it wasn't originally associated with oranges or the color orange, but it sounded like that, and so it became conflated with it. So there's this principality in southern France, another noble family, the House of Orange. William had a cousin named Rene. He was 15 years older. So he's 26, Rene. This is when William is 11 years old. And Rene is going off to fight in one of the many battles. And Charles V, we'll say more about him in just a moment, he's the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles V says to Rene, you're going off to battle. You have this vast land holding down in southern France. And I want to make sure that if something happens, God forbid, Rene, that this goes to the right sort of person. So Rene doesn't think too much about it. He doesn't think he's going to die in battle. And though it wasn't really natural that he would give it to William, but he said, okay, my younger cousin, he's 11 years old, sign the will. Anything happens to me, it goes to William. Well, sure enough, in 1544, Rene is killed in battle. And William, now he was from a noble family, but sort of middle-class nobility. Suddenly, he becomes one of the wealthiest noblemen in Europe. And his family isn't quite sure what to do with this. Well, good for our 11-year-old son. His whole life is turned upside down. He becomes a much more important person literally overnight when his cousin died. So now he is William of Nassau and of Orange. He goes to Brussels because that's the imperial court, and he is trained there. He lives a free-spirited life. Now just think if you're going to grow up as a teenage boy away from home, one of the wealthiest people in Europe, you're probably making some questionable decisions. He was free spending, he was sociable, he was gregarious, he had an interest in women, he liked to have a good time. He never completely left behind his religious upbringing, however, though he was now moving into, okay, if you're going to be this important political figure in Europe in the 1540s with Charles V, you're going to need to be Catholic. So he's raised Lutheran, he's like, okay, but I'll be a Catholic ruler if that's what I need to be. We can see something of William's religious transformation over the years if we just trace his wives. So this is fast forwarding through his life, then we'll come back in just a moment. But he had 4 wives, not the same scenario with Henry VIII. William was first married to Anna of Egmond for 7 years, and that was a marriage secured by the Holy Roman Emperor, Catholic. So Catholic Holy Roman Emperor says, I want you to marry Anna. He does. It was really a political alliance, but seemed to be happy. They had 3 children. Anna died at 25 years old. So most of these women are getting married as teenagers. And William is a young widower, and he is distraught. 1561, he married Anna of Saxony, also probably a political alliance. She was referred to as William's domestic curse. May it not be so. It's not so of anyone in here, but she really was cruel, irascible, self-absorbed, licentious, and probably certifiably mad. Now, when they were married in 1561, they did have a Lutheran ceremony. So you can see he had been a Catholic prince, and now he's moving back into his Lutheran tradition in 1561 when they get married. In 1571, Anna gives birth to a daughter that everyone knows, it's kind of an open secret, that's not William's daughter. And here, another one of these little factoids of history. The father of this child, Anna's lover, was Jan Rubens, the father of the painter Peter Paul Rubens. So William had the marriage to Anna dissolved when he found she had been unfaithful to him, and it was dissolved on account of insanity. In 1575, he married Charlotte. Charlotte. Now, that was a good match. Probably the first time in his life he married for love. Charlotte of the Bourbon family, a prominent Reformed family in France. So you can just see, first marriage, appointed by the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. Second marriage, Lutheran rite. Third marriage, now he marries a woman from a Calvinist family. It's a happy marriage. They have 6 children. She died in 1582. And then in 1583, he marries one more time Louise de Coligny, who was also from a deeply committed French Huguenot family. And they have one son, Frederick Henry, who will become the Prince of Orange. So you can see just in those 4 wives, death, annulment because of insanity and unfaithfulness, death, and then his last wife, Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist. So go back now. We have to understand the role that this man plays. We've already seen him before. You may remember him instrumental in Luther's story. Sorry, this half of the room, I know you can't see this. Charles V. In 1519, Charles was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. He had already been reigning as Charles I, the King of Spain, in 1516. He was not only one of Europe's most powerful men, he was really one of the most powerful rulers in European history. He had a vast domain throughout Europe, and now, in the 16th century, as we're entering on the period of colonization, with really Spain at first, and Portugal, and later the British. The Britain isn't a part of the Holy Roman Emperor, but this is extending his reach even across the seas. What many people forget about Charles V is he was from the Netherlands. He was born in the town of Ghent. Now remember, the Netherlands does not really exist yet as a country. Think about the word nether. Don't think about it too much, but the nether world is the lower world. The word nether, I'm not sure if it's related to the word nadir, but it sounds like that word. The word nether means lower. So the Netherlands just means the lowlands or the low countries. So at this time, the Netherlands, the lowlands, would be what today is the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and a little bit of northern France. So he was in Ghent, which is not today a part of the Netherlands, but here was a part of these lowlands. Low because they were underwater. A land reclamation project began in the 14th century to reclaim land that was under sea level. Like I said, today, the current geography of the Netherlands, about 25% of it was at one time covered in water. This fact, many scholars think, may contribute to the famed Dutch attachment to order and cleanliness. Look, we better make sure that the dikes are working or we're all going to drown. The lowlands was the most prosperous part of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles, being from Ghent, was relatively well liked. He gave the people of the lowlands a fair amount of autonomy as long as they remained loyal to him. And each of these provinces, so at this time there are 17 provinces in the Netherlands, and each one, well, sometimes one man might rule over multiple, but the provinces have a stadtholder, a holder of state. So he's the chief magistrate. You might think of him as the governor of the state, might be the closest equivalent. These were wealthy provinces which were regularly called upon to fund the Habsburgs. So this is the age of this dynasty in Europe. And in order to fund all the Habsburgs' military machine, they often would go to the richest part of the Holy Roman Empire, which are the lowlands. So Charles is he's from the lowlands, they're part of the Holy Roman Empire, and he takes William under his wing. Now, he wants to train him in the ways of imperial politics, and he also sees him as a valuable ally. After all, remember, William inherited these vast estates in southern France, so he's a connection point to French nobility. William became fluent in Flemish, German, Spanish, French, and Latin. Ironically, not Dutch. Flemish is sort of a dialect of Dutch. William takes him under his wing to train him. He will bring him on important diplomatic trips. Sometimes he is the only one present with Charles when foreign dignitaries come to visit. He was not only in the inner circle, sometimes William was the inner circle for Charles V. Charles, in the 1550s, is weary from ruling much of Europe, politics, travel, he's sick, everyone was sick. This is why, if you ask any historian of all the time periods you've studied, which one would you want to live in? They all say, right now. Because people were sick, their air conditioning often didn't work. When the electricity went out, it never came back on because it didn't exist. Man, are any of you still out of power? Well, good on you if you're still here. We had it like 15 hours, and I thought life was coming to an end. It's terrible. It was with all my kids alone, but he is the inner circle, and Charles wants to retire. This is really unheard of. Kind of like the Pope is just supposed to be the Pope until he dies. The Emperor is supposed to be the Emperor. But beginning in 1554, he starts abdicating his titles. It's all very complicated, but at this time in Europe, if you're the Holy Roman Emperor, you're also the king and the duke, and you have multiple titles. And he starts divesting himself from all of these titles and dividing up his vast empire. In one public abdication, so most of this is just happening privately. He says, I'm not going to be this principality anymore. Here, you can have it. The one public statement, he comes before the States General in the Netherlands, remember that's where he's from, in 1555. And who brings him up as Philip is aging and sick? He's leaning on the arm of William of Orange. And there Charles announces he's giving up the throne. And in 1556, the Spanish Empire, which included control of the Netherlands, is formally ceded to his son, Philip II. Now, if this were a movie, when it went from Charles to Philip, there would be very sinister music playing underneath. And you would see Philip in a corner, and he'd have a pointy eyebrow and an angular nose, and he'd be laughing a malevolent laugh. So Philip is going to be a bad guy in this story. He did not have the same skill as his father. Now, Charles, he was Catholic. He was definitely not a friend of the Reformation, but he was much more lenient than Philip would be. Philip was intent on punishing Protestants, crushing the Reformation. One, and I don't even think I mentioned this, Philip also had 4 wives who died at various times, and one of his wives was Mary Tudor. So he was married to Mary Tudor. So if you look, he was sort of king or king consort to queen to Bloody Mary. So that tells you something about Philip. He was married to Bloody Mary during her reign in England. This happened all the time. All these monarchs in Europe are intermarrying. He wants to get rid of Protestantism in the lowlands. And the more he persecutes the Protestants, the more William is drawn to their cause. Now remember, William's from Germany. He's probably most fluent in French. But he did spend time in Brussels, which is a part of the lowlands, and brought up there and trained there. And so he certainly spent time in the lowlands. There's one dramatic occasion. So remember, William was really one of the chief confidants of Charles V. So now that at least parts of the empire, the Spanish Empire, which includes the Netherlands, comes to Philip, Philip is not so sure. He doesn't trust William, and he shouldn't have. But he does have William in his inner circle. And on one occasion, Philip goes to France to meet with the Catholic king, Henry II. And Henry II and Philip are there conspiring in their plan, which is going to unfold over multiple years, and it's going to involve treachery and breaking treaties and lying, but this multi-year plan to exterminate the Protestants. Well, Henry II is out on this trip hunting in the woods with William. And Henry, thinking, well, I know that Chuck V over here, he shared everything with William and he's here with Philip. And so he spills the beans, and at one point he tells William of their scheme to, quote, eradicate that cursed vermin, the Protestants. And William hears it, is inwardly appalled, outwardly keeps his composure, gives every indication that he is Philip's trusted advisor, just like he was to Charles. And it is because of this incident that he has the name William the Silent, or William the Taciturn. His personality, everyone says, was very gregarious and sociable. So he was not introvert, but he's called William the Silent because on that matter, when it was divulged to him, Philip and Henry's plan to exterminate the Protestants, William, interesting, did not let on that inside he recoiled. And in the years that would then unfold, he would become Philip's most zealous opponent. So William becomes more and more involved in the affairs of state in the lowlands. He eventually tells Protestant leaders in Brussels what he heard about this plot. Philip puts his cousin or his sister, Margaret of Parma, as the regent. And she's somewhat flexible, but she's eventually replaced by one of the great villains of history, especially for Protestants, and that is from Spain, the Duke of Alva, or sometimes Alba. The Duke of Alva becomes the regent over the Netherlands. and he is intent on crushing the Protestants. Now, William at this point is the stadtholder for Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht, and he tries to ease the policy of persecution. And in his own holdings in France, which now France is in most parts of it is for Catholicism, he's in charge of Orange, and he says there's going to be toleration for Protestants in Orange. So he's trying to do the best that he can. He still is sort of torn. I have this Lutheran upbringing, and by 1561 he's had this Lutheran marriage, but he's ruling in name as a Catholic prince of Europe, but he feels this inner turmoil that he is an appendage to this persecution. He's in the inner circle with Henry and Philip as they plot to destroy the Protestants. Philip begins installing new bishops, and he gives to them the power of the Inquisition. This is the age of the Spanish Inquisition. No one ever expects the Spanish Inquisition. They did worse than pillows and comfy chairs. Look it up. Even many mild Catholics disliked the new bishops. They thought, wait a minute, we had control over, now Philip from Spain is just imposing these bishops. We can't make decisions for ourselves. And remember, the Dutch, you've all heard the joke from, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much. And it is true, and this is probably true for a lot, most people everywhere feel like the place that they're a part of is the best. But the Dutch, just because they're tiny and they're underwater, they did not think of themselves as the runt of the European litter. As far as they were concerned, they were the crown jewel of Europe. They had 300 walled cities. They had advanced trading and manufacturing. They had the wealthiest and the oldest nobles. They had the best painting, the best stained glass, the best tapestries, the best church music, the most splendid architecture, the grandest ports. They thought they were at the center of the European world. And they had been given by Charles relative autonomy. So when Philip comes in, and we see this in the American colonies, one of the ways to get a people rebelling real quickly is to have a kind of hands-off approach and then come on really hot and heavy and try to tell them what to do. So the Netherlands and the nobles are beginning to foment for rebellion and independence. But at this point, we call it the Netherlands, but you could look on a map and you could just see it's just dozens and dozens of these little Orange and Nassau, that's Germany and France, but just these little principalities and duchies and little places that nobles, there wasn't a Netherlands identity. But the identity, especially for the northern Netherlands, would in time come to be identified with Calvinism. Now you say, why not Lutheranism? You got Germany next door. Well, you have France next door too, and there are a lot of French Reformed. Well, there was something about the zeal of the Calvinists. They tended to be more tight-knit. Inheriting from Calvin, they tended to be very disciplined in their churches and in their order. They had a fighting spirit that appealed to the middle class. They had an intellectual sophistication which appealed to many of the elites. And the Calvinists in this time specialized in what they called hedge preaching. It's just open-air preaching. Couldn't be in the churches, we just preach, and they became popular with the masses. So the Netherlands is turning more and more reformed, and this often happens. As they're persecuted for being reformed, it becomes more important to them that they are reformed, and so to be Dutch and to be reformed becomes one and the same identity over time. In 1566, fed up with persecution, and they're unified because there's a famine, Calvinists decide to strike back. They ransack Catholic churches. They destroy icons, works of religious art. The rampage becomes known as the Beeldensturm, storm of pictures. And in response, Philip sends thousands of soldiers under the Duke of Alva to crush the rebellion. And the Duke arrives in Brussels, and he sets up what he calls the Council of Troubles, meaning troublers. And it's really a kangaroo court that's just set up to give a quick guilty verdict to the Protestants. They bring maybe 10,000 Protestants before them in the end. They kill or banish at least 1,000 of them, including some well-known noblemen. And in 1568, William returns to Nassau to collect his thoughts. And he isn't sure what to do. He's been trying to make things as good as he can for the Protestants, but he's been hesitating between two opinions a bit. In 1568, though, as he returns home, he decides once and for all that he is going to cast his lot decisively with the Calvinists, fully defend the Protestant cause. And so he invests all of his money. He's fabulously rich, but he did inherit a lot of debts from Orange as well. And he raises money from other nobles, and he amasses an army. 3 times, William raises an army to fight the Spanish, and his efforts never meet with much success. This war for Dutch independence, sometimes called the 80 Years' War, because though it tapered off, it really was from 1568 to 1648. What's 1648? That's the Peace of Westphalia. That's the first time that the Netherlands are officially recognized internationally as being an independent people. But beginning in 1568, William starts fighting for Dutch independence. It was only in 1648, however, that the 7 provinces of the Republic of the Netherlands were recognized as an independent state. Now, the one thing that kept the Netherlands from giving up, they were totally outmatched by the Spanish. They were not winning anything, though William was fighting valiantly. The one thing that they had was their navy. And maybe you've heard this term before, but there's a group of men who called themselves the Sea Beggars. There's a little Dutch Reformed college out in California, Providence Christian College, and their mascot are the Sea Beggars. You really got to be deep into Dutch history to get why they're called the Sea Beggars. Well, at one point earlier, when some of the Calvinist nobles are meeting with Margaret of Parma, remember she's the regent there, some of the people in Margaret's court whisper to her, and they say, you need not fear these beggars. Go, G-U-E-U-X. That's the word, beggars. Well, as so often happens with Puritans or Protestants or others, they own the negative label for themselves. All right, you think we're beggars? Then there is this group, the Watergezoin, the Sea Beggars. They were, you didn't know these people existed, they were basically Dutch Calvinist pirates. You got Halloween ideas if you celebrate that. They raided Spanish shipping, they harassed Spanish troops, they seized Spanish boats. They weren't a navy per se, they were a ragtag group of men who did know the swamps and the marshes and the canals of the lowlands better than the Spanish, and they kept the flame of hope alive for the Netherlands. They captured the city of Brielle in 1572. That was the first defeat for the Duke of Alva. The most dramatic story, and if we were Dutch and grew up in the Netherlands, we'd all know this story. It is one of the most remarkable stories in history that we've never heard of because we're not from this country, but it's the siege of Leiden. You've probably heard of the Dutch city of Leiden. So the Spanish surround the walls. It's a heavily fortified city. As often would happen, you just set yourself up outside of the city, and it's too much to try to breach the walls and to fight, and you're going to lose, so you just starve the people out. So the people are inside the city of Leiden. They're seeing the Spanish troops. People are starving to death, men, women, and children. At one low point, when they're considering giving up, the mayor of the city says, "Here is my sword. Plunge it, if you will, into my heart and divide my flesh among you to appease your hunger, but expect no surrender as long as I am alive." Another defender in the city said, "Let it be known that each one of us has 2 arms, and that if hunger makes it necessary, we shall eat the one and fight with the other." It's a great story. But they were all going to die. Their only hope were the sea beggars. But they're out at sea. And Leiden isn't close enough for the sea beggars to save them. But remember, much of the Netherlands used to be underwater. So their only hope is to unplug the dikes and to flood their own country so that the waters would come rushing in and that the navy, the sea beggars, could come from the sea. So, destroying much of what they had built over years and decades or centuries, they flood their own land, and sure enough, a great wind turns about, and on October 3rd, 1574, blows the ships toward Leiden. And they come in, they have military supplies, they have food for the beleaguered citizens, and they rout the Spanish forces. And the Dutch consider it, how could they not, that this was like the Battle of Jericho. This was God fighting for Israel like the Old Testament. God had given the wind. Later, Philip was to remark that he went there, sent the Spanish to fight the Dutch, but he didn't know he was going to have to fight the God of the wind and the waves. It would blow the ships, as they saw it, to their rescue. And in response to this great victory at Leiden, William says, this says something too about the Dutch character. What do we do to commemorate this great victory? He says, we are going to build in this spot a university. And so in 1575, it's the University of Leiden, which still exists, one of the most prestigious Dutch universities, one of the leading international research universities in the world. And it's probably not for no reason that when the Nazis came in and occupied the Netherlands in 1940, one of the first things they did was to shut down the University of Leiden. Always been considered a bastion of freedom and independence. In 1579, coming to the end, in 1579, the Union of Utrecht, well, you get that, the Union of Utrecht, under William's leadership as the stadtholder, the 7 provinces of the north, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Friesland, Groningen, Overijssel, and Gelderland, signed the Union of Utrecht, and they declared themselves to be a republic. The south remained Catholic, and that's a division that lasts today, though, most of that part of the world is sadly not very Christian. But Belgium and Luxembourg would become predominantly Catholic, and the Netherlands would become predominantly Protestant. And though the Netherlands is sadly one of the most liberal places anywhere, there is still you can go Google, there is still a Dutch Reformed Bible Belt that goes through the middle of the Netherlands, where you would find very traditional, black-suited, almost somber Dutch Reformed churches that would still be of pretty good size for Western Europe. Now, what motivated William to do all of this? Well, no doubt he was motivated on several fronts. One, he sympathized with a suffering people. Two, all his life he hated persecution. Now, to be fair, when the Calvinists eventually have control, they're not always tolerant either. But William was ahead of his time in seeing toleration. And people have often, why did the Dutch, why have they so often been tolerant and, in recent years, too tolerant, we would say? Well, it could be a number of different things. One of the things may be because the Catholic and the Protestant vied with each other, and it wasn't always sure who was going to come out on top. And when you're not sure that when you're at the top, you're going to be on the top very long, then maybe you think that toleration sounds like a good idea. At least that's one theory. He was against the persecution, and he resonated, and he wanted to defend a beleaguered people. He supported freedom of conscience. He wrote a work called An Apology, and it was a defense of revolting against the sovereign when a sovereign becomes a tyrant. Sounds familiar to us. But it's also true that William had a genuine spiritual transformation, I think. He became convinced of the Reformed faith. In 1573, he officially joins the Calvinist Church. He appoints a man I mentioned just earlier, Jean Taffin. You can get some of his works in English. They're wonderful devotional works. He was the court preacher for William. He became the father of a new nation, and that nation was Calvinist. William's life would come to a dramatic end. Philip hated William, hated him. More than William opposed and lamented what Philip was doing, but Philip had an implacable hatred for William, who was his confidant and now was fighting against him. To that end, in 1580, Philip put a bounty on William's head. The King Philip, offered a reward of 25,000 crowns, a monetary unit, and a noble title. He'd make you a noble. He'd give you 25,000 crowns if you would kill Prince William of Orange. In 1582, William was shot right through the face, and he didn't die. It didn't break his jaw. Somehow it went through. It didn't hit any organ. I mean, it looked like he was going to die, and he didn't die. If he was beloved already, he gets shot in the face, and he doesn't die, and now the people love him anymore. He had also refused to make himself sovereign. People are saying, well, why don't you be the sovereign? Nope. Kind of like George Washington steps down after 2 presidential terms. He's nursed back to health by his wife, Charlotte. She probably died because of the stress and because of the strain on nursing him back to health. But he survives, and there's a bounty on his head, and he continues to keep his doors open. At this time, you could just come to the administrative headquarters, and maybe there's a guard there or something, but just say, I need to see William. And a whole bunch of people could go see William. A man by the name of Balthazar Gerard came in to the headquarters in Delft, and he poses as a Calvinist refugee. I'm here, I need to see William. And William welcomes him in, and on July 10, 1584, he gets shot by this French Catholic fanatic who shoots him right through the lungs and the stomach, and he dies almost immediately on the spot. Some people had credited William's resolve in these years with his newfound belief in God's sovereignty. When it's time, it's time. Others wanted him, his wife certainly wanted him to take more precautions, but he's shot by an assassin's bullet. It is the first time in history that someone is assassinated with a handgun. Sadly, not the last. Officials capture this man, Gerard, almost immediately. They torture him in gruesome ways. The nation mourned the death. I mean, William was their Abraham, their Moses, their King David. William's son, Maurice, I was a pastor in Orange City, Iowa, named after William of Orange, probably the third William. And there was a little town nearby. They called it Morris, but it was Maurice. They just called it Morris. I think they didn't want to sound French, but that was named after his son. Well, Prince Maurice was not the enlightened man that his father was, but he was a better general. And so he began to win victories against the Spanish. And, almost done, as a result of this murder in 1584, this is how history is not a straight line when you live it. There's all sorts of contingency. Because of this murder in 1584, in 1585, who makes an alliance with the Dutch? The English do. All right, they're Protestants, we're Protestants, we are on the side of the Dutch. And if you remember anything from history, you may remember 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Armada is sent to the coast of the Netherlands. But because of this alliance, the English say, we have to defend the Dutch. They're Protestants like us. And famously, the English rout the Spanish Armada. Of 130 Spanish ships that set out to the Dutch coast, only 60 of them return. And then, if you remember this from your Western Civ class, 1689, sometimes called the Glorious Revolution, James II, Catholic monarch in England, He is declared by Parliament, since he left the country, to have abdicated the throne. So England needs a king. And who do they bring in, you remember? They bring in William III, the great-grandson of William the Silent, and his wife, Mary II. We have a William and Mary College here in the United States. This William and Mary. Mary is English. William, of course, is Dutch. They have a Dutch monarch brought to sit on the throne in England because we need a Protestant. Where do we get our Protestants from? We get them from the Netherlands. It's much more I could say here about the impact over the years that the Netherlands and this has had. But you think about even just the color orange. In Northern Ireland, during the Troubles, the Protestants were identified with the color orange. One time in my last church, I made the mistake on St. Patrick's Day to say something about I was wearing green. And one of the men who was from Belfast said, no, you wear orange. St. Patrick's is ours, and we wear orange. Orange became identified with the color of Protestantism. Even the Presbyterians in the 1800s, when they establish Princeton, it's called the College of New Jersey then. It's in a little town in New Jersey called Princestown. It's named after this prince, William III. And the building, which is still standing today, 1746 it was built, is called Nassau Hall. We're going to establish our Presbyterian Reformed school here in Princestown, named after William III, and we're going to name it Nassau Hall, after the great William of Orange and Nassau. His last words as he lay dying are recorded, "My God, have pity on my soul. My God, have pity on this poor people." William the Silent was buried in the new church at Delft, and the inscription on his grave reads this: "To the glory of God and to the everlasting memory of William of Nassau, father of the fatherland, who valued the fortunes of the Netherlands above his own." And I am grateful that he did, and you should be too. See you over there. Next week, John Bunyan.